What's up, hobby friends? Welcome to my series on Photoshop, where I'm going to teach you how to use this very versatile digital painting and photo editing program. For those of you following along and you have older versions of Photoshop, the functionality for the purpose that we're going to be using the program for is essentially the same. It hasn't really changed throughout the different versions of Photoshop. All they've really added are bells and whistles, tweaks, and most recently with the Creative Cloud, cloud saving and auto updating of the software as long as you're paying for the subscription. But regardless of the version of Photoshop you have, more or less everything's going to be the same, so you can follow along. If you don't have Photoshop but still want to get into doing some basic photo editing, photo manipulation, there is a free version on the web called Photopea.com. This is a free version. It has a lot of the core functionalities of Photoshop. It is missing some of the bells and whistles, but it gets the job done. And I will be teaching you using both the browser and the Photoshop program side by side, so that regardless of which one you're using, you'll be able to follow along and build those skills. So in this video, we're going to talk through the basic layout of the program. We're going to talk through the workspace you're working with. We'll set up the preferences for our program for how we want it to behave. We're going to learn to create a new file. We're going to talk through the different color modes and how to work through our file resolutions. We're going to look at changing our document settings once we have that file set up. And then we're going to look to save our file. We're going to look through some of the different outputs that we're going to be using and how to optimize or how to compress our file when we're saving it for the web to save on memory. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up and set up our preferences in Photoshop. Now you can find that in the menu bar up top. If you go to Edit, on the very bottom, Preferences. You can already see that we have Photoshop telling us what the shortcuts are. And the shortcut for opening the Preferences window is Control-K. And many of Photoshop's menu preferences are going to be some form of Control and a keystroke, or a Control-Alt keystroke, or a Control-Shift keystroke. You can set these up, you can change them. If you go to the keyboard shortcuts, you can change them to really whatever you want them to be. Just be aware that if you change it to one that's already in use, it will override and remove that. All these different options you can find if you open up the Preferences window. These are just for easy and quick reference. So we're going to go ahead and open that up, and you can see our preference window is now open. In Photopea, it's the exact same thing, Edit, Preferences, but you can see that it's very, very limited. There's not much you can change about it because, of course, Photopea isn't going to be worrying about creating backups for us. It's not going to worry about auto-saving, and you really can't adjust the number of undos or history states, which is really what we're going to be concerned about. So that's one of the limitations of using Photopea. As you can see with Photopea, because it is free, it does limit us in terms of our number of history steps. That's essentially the number of times that we can undo. If you pay for the premium version, you get double the amount, 60 steps. It's up to you. I think the free one's fine. So in Photoshop, when we're in preferences, really the two important ones that we're going to be worrying about are our history step, so much like in Photopea where it's 30/60. Under performance, you can see that Photoshop has much more depth in terms of the amount of history states that we can control or we can have. And we go anywhere from 1 up to 1,000. The higher the number, because it has to save that information for each individual history state, it's going to greatly increase the performance drain that Photoshop is going to put on your computer. If we're doing a lot of digital painting, we're doing a lot of individual brushstrokes and very minor changes, you're going to want to have this set at a higher number. Anywhere from 1 to 200 is a pretty good number. If we're doing photo editing and digital manipulation, most of our steps are bigger changes. We're doing less of them, and you might be able to get away with a lower number, maybe around the 20 or 30 like Photopea has. Because I like to find a balance between the two, I typically leave it at 100. It's not too taxing on my computer, and it gives me enough of a history to undo a fair number of changes without worrying about having gone too far. In terms of memory usage, we want to allocate almost as much of our RAM as possible to allow Photoshop to run smoothly. Depending on what you intend to have running in the background on your computer, you allocate more or less. I typically set it at around the 68 to 70% because when I'm using Photoshop, I'm not using anything else. I want as much of my RAM dedicated to this program as possible, and I'll leave a bit of a buffer for any background processes that are running. And if I need to run some other software simultaneously, like Illustrator, or if I need to run a browser or something else like Zoom or Skype if I'm working, this gives me a bit of a buffer in the RAM without slowing down my computer. The other thing that we want to worry about is our file saving options. This sets where we will save our files by default when we hit Control Save or when we save as, so creating a duplicate with Control Shift Save. But the other important part of this preference option is saving recovery information. Now, nothing's worse than working on a file for however long, 1, 2, 3 hours. You forget to save, and then suddenly your computer crashes, or you lose power, or something happens where you suddenly lose the file. The program crashes or closes. You want to set Photoshop to automatically save recovery information that you can try and retrieve, and it'll do this in the background as you're working on the file. You can play around with these settings, and if you find that the performance of Photoshop is worse than you'd like, you can sort of adjust the interval of saving the recovery information, and you can also adjust your performance settings in terms of how much RAM you're allocating and your history states. In the preferences are also a lot of adjustments that we can make to the layout of our Photoshop program. And as we go through some of the different tools and we're learning about how to use the program more in depth, we'll be returning to these preferences, and we'll cover them more as we go. There's a lot in here, and just as we're setting up our file, we don't have to worry about anything really apart from our file handling and performance. So once we've set that up, let's go ahead and create a new file. Under File, New. Again, you can see that the shortcut key for creating a new file is Control-N. So let's go ahead and do that. And it's going to give us a bunch of options. It has some defaults or some templates, depending on how what you've used before, what you've opened before, and what Photoshop might anticipate that you're trying to do, or what it anticipates you do most often. It will provide some either recents, or you can browse for some templates that you want to use. What I really want to talk about is your image size, your resolution, and your color mode. So let's start with the color mode. You're going to have a variety of colors, and there's really only two that we care about. It's RGB and CMYK. RGB stands for red, green, blue, and it's the color mode of web or of monitors. Basically, if the work that we're doing is digital and we're never going to print it, we want our color mode to be RGB so that it is the most accurate on our web devices, on our phones and tablets. And that's because of the way monitors and these digital devices handle color. They use a subtractive mode where the more color you add, the closer it gets to white. The other mode is CMYK, and that's cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And this is our print mode. And that's because all printers use these four colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And they use what's called an additive mode. That is, the more color you add, the more intense it gets. The less color there is, the more closer to white it becomes. If what you're working on is ultimately destined for print, then you're going to want to work in CMYK mode, and you're also going to want to color adjust, if possible, your monitor to reflect the settings on your printer. And that will allow you to most accurately create your document. You can see on your monitor what it will look like. And then when you print to a particular printer, it'll be as accurate as possible to what you're seeing on the screen. Most of our stuff will be for a digital purpose, and so we're going to stick with RGB. 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit represents the number of colors, or the amount of colors, and we want this as big as possible. 8 or 16 are fairly standard. Between 16 and 32, I've never really noticed a significant difference. It's up to you and your personal preference. We're going to go with our 16-bit color. And then lastly, we're going to talk about our file size. When we're working with digital, we really don't care about the exact physical dimensions of our files. So we're talking like inches, centimeters, millimeters. And that's because when we're working with digital, everything's in pixels. Pixels are always the set square, and they're always the same size. So we realistically never care about the physical dimensions unless we intend to take the file to print. An image that's 1,000 by 1,000 pixels is always going to be 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, regardless of the device that we go to, whether it's viewed on a computer in a web browser or we're viewing it on a phone or a tablet. And so when we're creating our files for web or for digital purposes, really the only resolution we care about is pixels. And for example, most HD monitors are going to be 1920 by 1080. And we're going to hear a lot talked about resolution in terms of pixels per inch or PPI. It's a measurement of how many pixels are going to be crammed into a 1 inch by 1 inch square when we're printing. The higher the number, the more information is placed into that 1 inch by 1 inch square. And I guess the smaller the translation of our file from digital, or what we see on the screen, to the print. So for example, and I'm going to keep the math simple on this. I'm going to try to keep it simple. If we have an image that's 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, and we set our resolution to 100 pixels per inch, when we go to print that file, what that means is it's going to have 100 pixels for every inch. So when we're looking at pixels per inch for print, the value is a square. So if it's set at 10 pixels per inch, that means for every inch, you're going to have 10 pixels or 10 squares across and 10 squares down. And that gives us 100 dots. So if we were to set our image to 100 pixels per inch, that means that we're going to have 100 pixels across and 100 pixels down of information within that image. And that would mean that our image at 1,000 pixels wide, 1,000 divided by 100 is 10. So our image ends up being 10 by 10 inches. If we were to increase our resolution to 200, we're doubling the amount of information that we're putting into every inch of an image being printed. So what that means is that for every inch being printed, or every inch of space, we're going to have 200 pixels across and 200 pixels down, right? We've doubled the amount of pixels that are being printed. What that means is that our same image that's 1,000 by 1,000 pixels wide and high, it's now going to be half in terms of our print size. 1,000 pixels divided by 200 is only 5 times. That means the image ends up being 5 inches by 5 inches. That's half. In terms of the image in the digital space, the size hasn't changed. It's still 1,000 by 1,000, but when you go to print it, the difference in resolution between 100 and 200 is 100%. The image at 100 pixels is going to be 10 by 10, and an image at 200 resolution is going to be 5 by 5, half the size. With print, you want to go as high as you can with pixels per inch for quality. When you have a high resolution image that's printed, it's going to be very high quality, as opposed to something that might be a lower resolution printed at the same size. Because we're working mostly with digital content that's never going to be printed, we can actually go fairly low with this. And a standard, or the old standard, would have been 72 pixels per inch, intended for web purposes. But because we're not printing, it doesn't matter. You can put it at 1 pixel per inch. It's largely irrelevant. Your image is still going to be 1,000 by 1,000, and it only becomes a difference when we go to print. So we're going to go ahead and just create this document. We're going to set it at 1,000 by 1,000 at 72 pixels per inch. And we have our document. Quickly jumping back to Photopea, just to do the same thing. So we're going to create a new project, and we can see that it mimics a lot of the same functions as Photoshop. It gives us a bunch of templates that we can use with preset sizes and resolutions, or we can have our own custom. We can set it to pixels, percentage, or some real measurements. We're going to leave it at pixels. We're going to do the same thing. And then our resolution. Now here you're seeing it says DPI, which is actually dots per inch. And dots per inch is a holdback to, or a reference to, printers who would print similar to pixels per inch. It's dots per inch, but they're functionally the same thing. When it's saying dots per inch, it's saying dots across and dots down. So an image that's 72 DPI is functionally the same as 72 PPI. This might have been an issue way back when printers were not quite as advanced, and the dots were fairly big. You actually had to keep track of how many dots per inch relative to pixels per inch, perhaps. And there might have been some sort of conversion that you're working on. But nowadays, with how advanced our technology is, they're functionally the same. So you can throw around DPI, PPI. They both mean the same thing. They're only really important when it comes to printing. And that's not something that we're really going to be concerned about. So we're going to create a document. And so looking at the program now, we can see that the layout or the workspace is essentially the same. We have our rulers. We have our menu up top. This right here is the toolbar. And this changes based on the tool that you're going to be using. It gives you some options to fine-tune how that tool performs. And we'll cover those more in detail as we go through the toolbar in a future video. Photopea does the exact same thing. On the right, we're going to have our tool windows and options windows. And these you can customize by dragging and dropping. You can find which ones you have opened if you open up your window in the menu bar. And these give you options to fine-tune different aspects of, also linked to our tools, but also things like our swatch and color palettes. We can look at our pattern library. We can even look at, for example, our file history. So when we're talking about our file states or our history states, we can actually look at this and selectively pick, delete. We can revert. Instead of manually going back step by step, one at a time, we can actually make jumps in our history with this history bar or history window. Photopea, very much the same thing, although not quite as feature-rich as Photoshop. It's very limited in the number of windows that it gives you access to, but it gives you a lot of the core functions that we intend to use most often. In terms of windows, I mostly use paragraph, character, history, and brushes. Those are my four main ones. Those are usually the ones I have open. And you can see that those key ones are all here as well. With our document open, we also have the option to adjust some of our document settings, namely the size in terms of pixels or physical dimensions, and our resolution, that is our pixels per inch. We have two options or two ways of doing this, and they can both be found under the image menu. And they are image size and canvas size. Image size changes our entire image. All of our information, all of our data, all of our graphics gets scaled along when we change the image size. And this is useful for taking an image and either scaling everything down or scaling everything up proportionally. Changing the canvas size is about changing your workspace. So if you imagine that this is your piece of paper, right? And let's say you wanted to double the space. You wanted to add more space on your paper to work with without changing the size of your image. Adjusting the canvas size is a way to do that without affecting anything that we've created in our document so far. So I'll demonstrate what I mean with both options. So first, starting with the easy one, canvas size. When we open up our canvas size menu, we're given the options to change the width or height in terms of pixels or any other dimension we choose, and how to anchor it. By default, it anchors around the center, so any changes we make applies equally around. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to double the size of our canvas. We're going to make it 2000 pixels by 2000 pixels, anchored around the center. And we click OK. So you can see that our original image hasn't changed, it hasn't moved, but our canvas size has now doubled in all four directions. I can show you this with a transparency. So you can see, represented by this transparent area, which is this gray and white box pattern or cross hatch pattern. Our canvas size has increased, but our original image has stayed the same. Our anchor point determined where the image, our original image, would be centered, and then it increased on all four directions equally to our new dimension size. If we wanted our original image to stay in the top left and to increase our canvas only on the bottom and onto the right, we can change the anchor point by clicking these arrows. So if we anchor the image represented by the circle to the top left, you can now see our canvas has been expanded in the opposite directions. Similarly, we can anchor to the bottom right, and it does the same thing in reverse. When we go to change our image size, Photoshop is going to change our entire image. It's going to scale it up based on the changes we make, and not just the canvas. By default, Photoshop constrains both the width and the height proportionally. Because our image is a square image, 1 by 1, whenever we change the width, it's going to change the height proportionally. So you can see if I try to change the width to 2000 pixels, it also changes the height to 2000 pixels. And that's to maintain the ratio of our image. We can turn this feature off by clicking this chain, and this allows us to change both values independently. However, when we break that aspect ratio or we change that aspect ratio, you can see that Photoshop has now stretched, based on our changes, the image to 2000 pixels wide. It's essentially stretched at 200%, and now our image and everything in it is now wider than it is tall. So when you do an image size change and you change the aspect ratio of your image, be very, very careful how you change that. You also have the option to change your resolution. And this is really only important when we're trying to adjust it from a digital format to print or print to digital. In practice, I've very rarely gone from a low resolution to a high resolution image. Most often, I go from a high resolution, that is my high fidelity original file that is usually created for print. And then if we have to convert that data or that graphic into a digital file, I then downgrade the resolution. Photoshop by default sets it to resample this image. And so whenever we change the resolution, it adjusts the width and height of the pixels to match. So if we were to double the resolution from 72 to 144, you can see that it's now doubled the width and the height in pixels. And the reason it does this is to maintain the same print size. So you can see that at 72 pixels per inch, our original image is just shy of 14 inches. To change the resolution to 144, Photoshop will resample the image so that it maintains its original print size. If we turn that off, Photoshop doesn't change. It doesn't resample the pixels. And what it does is it maintains its fidelity of the original design. So if we originally intended for the image to print at 72 pixels per inch, when we increase that and we wanted to print twice the amount of information within that same inch space, it's going to adjust it based on that and scale it down to maintain the quality of the image. Remember when we spoke earlier about pixels per inch and how increasing that value changes our image size based on how much data we're putting into a square? That's what this is. So something you have to be really, really careful about is when you change, or when you tell Photoshop to change the image size and you're adjusting the amount of pixels, what Photoshop is really doing is it's trying to fill in the gaps. When you have an image that's a particular size and you try and scale down, or you shrink it down. So for example, our image is 1000 by 1000 and we're going to cut it down to 500 by 500. That's easy. The pixels already exist. The data is real. And it's much easier for Photoshop to remove the information in between. We're not adding anything new. We're just cutting out some of the unnecessary information. And Photoshop does a very good job of maintaining our original image while scaling it down. The problem becomes when we try and scale up. When we increase the amount of pixels in an image, what we're really doing is we're telling Photoshop to try and guess and predict to fill in the information. When we go from, in this example, 1000 to 2000 pixels, we've now doubled the amount of squares of color in the image. Unfortunately, half of those, 1000 of those pixels in both directions, didn't exist before. We haven't created that data, and we're telling Photoshop to guess or to create that data out of thin air based on the pixels around it. The issue then is Photoshop in its guessing. It's imperfect. the image quality ends up reducing. We end up with fuzzy edges, our colors and our gradients might not be as smooth as Photoshop tries to fill in the gaps and maintain the design of our image while increasing its size. So I highly recommend that you avoid, if possible, scaling up your image in terms of pixel size. Always try and start with a larger image and then scale down if you find that you need to resize the image. If we go to Photopea, it has both the same options in terms of image size, adjusting both the width and height in pixels and real measurements, as well as our dots per inch, which is equivalent to our pixels per inch. The option to constrain the aspect ratio, and then resampling if we are changing our DPI or PPI resolution. Similarly, in adjusting the canvas size, we can change width and height in pixels or real measurements, locking in the aspect ratio, and picking our anchor point. You also have the option to change your color mode if you have a file that was originally intended to print and then you want to bring it over to digital or vice versa. You can do that as well under the image menu. You go to mode and you can pick the color mode that you want to be in. When you switch from RGB to CMYK or vice versa, you're going to see a slight color change or color shift in your image. And that is because the way Photoshop handles those colors is different. Remember, one is an additive mode, one is a subtractive mode, and Photoshop handles that information differently. Typically, I find going from RGB to CMYK results in a slight desaturation, depending on your color settings of your image, while going from CMYK to RGB results in a slightly higher saturation. Now, Photopea unfortunately doesn't give you the option to change your color mode. Once you've created your file, either in RGB or CMYK, you're stuck with that color format. There's no option to change that, and that's one advantage that Photoshop has over Photopea. But again, in practice, that's very rarely a feature that I found I've used, so your mileage may vary depending on whether you need to bounce between the different color modes. So once we have our image done, we're done working with it, we want to save it. We go to File and Save. The keyboard shortcut is Control-Save, much like in other programs. And gives us our save option. Really straightforward. We pick where we want to save our file. We're going to have a bunch of different file types. The ones that you're predominantly going to be working with, if you want to keep the editing features or functions of your file, are going to be either as a Photoshop document, so it's a PSD, or as a large document format, which is a PSB. Functionally, they're both the same. I forget what the cutoff is, but I think once your files get over 1 or 2 gigs in size, they can no longer be saved as a Photoshop file or a PSD. They have to be saved as a large document format Photoshop file, which is a PSB. Functionally, they're the same. Unless you're doing big digital paintings, you're never really going to get to those file sizes. So saving it as a PSD for your working document is perfectly fine. So just going to go ahead and save that to our desktop as test. So when it comes to saving our files as an output format, we're looking to save it as either a GIF, a JPEG, or a PNG. So the primary differences between them, GIFs and PNGs are both lossless formats, whereas a JPEG is lossy. So a JPEG has compression features in there, and it has greater control or fine-tune balancing in terms of the quality of the image that we're outputting versus balancing the file size. So JPEGs are really, really good for saving photographs and when we're looking to really optimize our files. GIFs and PNGs are both really, really good when your image has large areas of uniform colors. And in the case of GIFs, when your image has less than 256 colors. But because PNGs no longer have that color limitation like GIFs do, and PNGs can also handle transparencies where GIFs can't, you're almost never going to save as a GIF. You're really looking to save it as a PNG for the most part if you want to have a transparency on your image. And in every other case, you're going to save as a JPEG. So when we go and we save our image, we save as, and we can save our type as a JPEG or a PNG. When we go to save as a JPEG, it gives us some basic options in terms of the quality of our image. as a determinant for our file size. And this is really, really handy for when you need to reduce the file size of your image and you don't mind taking a bit of a hit in the quality. When you save as a PNG, it has some options to adjust the file size, but you can't really fine tune it. You really only have the 3 options, and that's pretty much it. The way we save our files in Photopea, we really have 2 options. We can save as a PSD, and it just downloads it to our downloads folder, so you can move the working file to wherever you want. Or you can export. It gives us the same options of PNG or a JPEG or a GIF, and when we export, it gives us options to fine-tune the quality. You can see it actually has a little more depth in terms of percentage for a PNG, or a JPEG, or a GIF. This is where I actually like Photopea's options in terms of exporting. Particularly with the PNG, it gives us a little more granularity. As opposed to just low, medium, high, we actually have a percentage. We have a lot more steps in terms of how much we can optimize our PNG file. The one thing that Photoshop has that Photopea doesn't have that I really like using, particularly when I'm saving for web, and I don't believe it's in the file menu option, but something that's hidden. You Control-Alt-Shift-Save. And this is a holdover from some of the older versions of Photoshop. It gives us our Save for Web menu feature. Now this allows us to further optimize our files beyond just what the Save As function does. And when we go to a JPEG, for this particular test image, it's not going to make a big difference because there's only 2 colors, black and white, and not a lot of information. But when we start saving more complex images or graphics, when you go Save As a JPEG and you go medium quality versus Save for Web at a medium quality, there's actually a huge difference. I don't know what this program does, but it works its magic, and it super optimizes and it really reduces your file size without taking a overly significant quality hit in your image. So when I'm saving for web, when I'm looking to upload things to my website, I always save for web as a JPEG or a PNG, and I fine tune the quality as I see fit. And what I like about the Save for Web feature is it allows us to preview what our changes will do in terms of quality. So that's a feature I really, really like when optimizing my files. So that's that for this video. I hope it wasn't too much information to throw at you. I'm trying to break down a lot of these different tools and a lot of the functions of this program into separate videos, and I'm trying to be as in-depth as I can because I know that there's a lot in this program to cover and there is a steep learning curve. For those who have been using Photoshop for a while or Adobe programs for a while, it actually becomes easier because all of Adobe's programs use the exact same layout. A lot of the tools and shortcuts function the same. So once you've become familiar with one program, you can really jump between them, say for example into Illustrator or After Effects or Premiere, and you'll already be familiar with the workspace, with the way the program's laid out, and you know how everything functions. When you're just starting out, there's a lot to cover and it's going to be overwhelming. And so I always suggest baby steps. I like a learn as you go method. And so what we're going to be doing moving forward in future videos is we're going to be doing things with images, and we'll learn tools or learn how to use different tools or options as we do them. If you have questions I haven't covered from this video, or you have questions that you want me to cover in future videos, feel free to leave a comment, send me a message. I will create a list and get to them as I can, I promise. And I will try and cover topics that you guys struggle with, that you guys have challenges with. So definitely leave me a comment, throw your questions at me, and I will try and answer them as best I can in future videos or by responding directly. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was informative. I hope you follow along for future videos, and I hope that as you follow along, you'll become more proficient with Photoshop and more confident in using the program. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more awesome content, and to follow my Instagram at SirJohnTheHo for daily updates on my hobby content. That's all for now. Until next time, happy hobbying.